Okay, I want to thank everyone for joining us here today on our second day of RAM Symposium. And very happy today to have Sam Ernst and Bill Moseley here with us to present the Opaque World, Gifts, Grants, and Private Foundation Grant Seeking at CSU. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Sam and to Bill to introduce themselves.
Great. Thank you, Shannon, for that. We're happy to be here, and thanks to you all for signing in today. Our goal is to shine a little light on the people and processes related to private foundation grant making and fundraising across campus. So we'll start with introductions. I'm Sam Ernst. I work in the Office of Foundation Relations within University Advancement, and I'll let Bill introduce himself.
I'm Bill Moseley. I'm the pre-award manager in sponsored programs. Many of you probably already know me.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill. And I got to say, I'm very glad you're here today to lend a hand. It underscores the close collaboration that already exists between our two units. So the topic of private foundation grant seeking has probably become only more germane since we started planning this RAM Symposium session back in 2024. Given the instability and uncertainty at the federal level, I'm curious to know, we'll start with a question, how many folks out there have noticed an uptick in interest in private foundation fundraising?
We're getting hands and
hands,
we're getting reactions as well. So yeah, look at that.
Yep.
We're seeing a lot and across the board from what I saw, different colleges and units as well.
All right. Well, good. So hopefully whatever clarity we're able to offer today will help pave the way to even closer collaboration in the months and years to come, because I think it's probably safe to assume that interest in non-federal funders will continue to grow for the time being. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's talk about why we're here today. And to do that, I'm going to be a little bit like James Michener, who wrote a lot of very long books. Chief among them, perhaps Centennial, all about northern Colorado. And aside from that geographic significance and link, Michener worked really hard to establish the context in all of his books, and that's what I'm going to try to do now. In most of his novels, he starts at some distant point in history and then works forward. In Centennial, he chose the geologic origins of Colorado as his starting point. And don't worry, I'm not going to take his lead and go into minutia about the links between the Farallon plate and the Laramide orogeny. I'm not going to do that. But like that tumbled mass of plates and faults underpinning North America, I will admit that I struggled with how to structure today's content, as it is at best a Gordian knot of interconnected topics where knowing about one naturally informs another. But then I did have an idea that before we slice into the knotty details of process, we could at the very least start by establishing some common ground regarding the names and units you might hear mentioned in connection to foundation grants at CSU. There were some questions about this as we were preparing this presentation. So let's start with three simple questions. What is foundation relations? What is university advancement? And what is the CSU Foundation? So first then, at its most basic, foundation relations is a central unit within university advancement. Our mission is to strengthen relationships between CSU faculty and staff and private foundations by developing and stewarding those relationships. Being central, we help folks all across campus with a number of different services, including finding grant opportunities, developing grant-seeking strategies, reading proposal drafts, providing feedback on those, and more. I'll go into more detail about that process later, but for now, I'll just say we're here to work in parallel with sponsored programs and all the research administrators out there to help maximize proposal competitiveness. So then going one level up, let's talk about university advancement. This is the chief fundraising arm of CSU. It's the overarching division in which central fundraising units like foundation relations and corporate engagement sit. However, advancement not only houses centralized units, but also extends across the colleges and units which have their own dedicated fundraising staff. And at this point, you might be thinking, having two sets of fundraisers seems like a little bit of an overlap. But where the central teams focus on institutional and organizational relationships, the college and development unit development teams, they focus primarily on individual donors. Now, occasionally, unit-based development staff are involved in certain aspects of foundation or corporate asks, but this is optimally in partnership with the respective central advancement team, helping to ensure coordination across the spectrum of that relationship. Another bit of useful context to know about advancement is that most of the funds raised by UA, particularly those from individual donors, are received by the CSU Foundation. Foundation and corporate awards are horses of a different color, but we shall get to that in due time. Finally, on the advancement front, it can sometimes help to be aware that advancement is made up of CSU employees, just like many of the research administrators and sponsored programs folks logged in today's session. We don't work for the CSU Foundation. It's currently just the entity that receives CSU's charitable philanthropic contributions. Every university divides the labor a little differently in this regard. There's many different structures. Sometimes the fundraising staff are employees of the foundation. It doesn't change the work, it just different structures at different places. Now, after all that, you're probably wishing I had been a little more like Michener and started at the beginning of geologic time. That probably would have been more interesting than exploring the fine distinctions of bureaucratic administrivia, right? Wrong. We're not quite out of the woods yet, unfortunately. Mercifully, though, there's just one more piece of the fundraising landscape I should tell you about before we move on to putting this all in action. The CSU Foundation, or CSUF for short. I've hinted at it a lot of this already, but for quick review, CSUF is CSU's associated 501c3 nonprofit. Its mission is to maximize philanthropic investments in perpetuity for the betterment of CSU, and CSU Foundation is responsible for establishing 6-4 gift funds for incoming awards and helping connect those to 5-3 sponsored project accounts when necessary. And I'm sure that last point brings up all sorts of questions regarding gifts versus grants, but I'm going to keep you all in suspense about that topic for a little while longer. So phew, that's a lot of introductory context. You probably feel as adrift and fragmented as the modern continental landscape, but never fear, eventually all things merge and a process runs through it. So let's come together like Pangea Proxima and see how all of these pieces link up. Let's just hope it doesn't take another 250 million years to do it. So first off, who should you talk to and when? Though we've been accused of being vegetative at times, my colleagues and I in foundation relations are surprisingly responsive. So for any proposals or inquiries to private foundations, please loop us in as early as possible. We not only help maximize competitiveness by providing proposal narrative review and feedback, but can also assist with providing CSU Foundation related documents for those funders that require submission under the auspices of a 501c3. More on that topic later. For now, it suffices to say that in most cases, for private foundation proposals, there shouldn't necessarily be a need for PIs or research admins to directly engage with CSUF or other UA personnel on the pre-award side. I should also give a quick plug to Greg Lewis in corporate engagement and partnerships for any asks involving companies. He should be the one looped in, not the foundation relations team. So now that we've touched on the people, let's move on to the process itself. And oddly enough, plate tectonics works as a metaphor here too. You see, the process of foundation grant seeking is not singular, and instead, like Bob Dylan or Walt Whitman, it contains a multitude of interlinked and related processes. It's just that some of these links might be hard to discern or lurking just under the surface, ready to burst forth and brighten your day at any moment. So let's start then with a couple poll questions to help you sit up, do some clicking, dispel that catatonia that may have set in by this point of my talking. So how many of you out there have previously worked on private foundation proposals?
Okay, again, across kind of a wide variety. I can't tell who's we are getting thumbs up from, but
Right.
the people who've raised their hands, I think I've seen every
Great.
college at least.
A good number. That's good. And then more specifically, how many of you have worked with foundation relations in some way? My office. So it's good. There's a certain level of experience out there amongst the group, and hopefully today's session can help clarify and augment that institutional knowledge that you all already have, so we can further refine our collaboration and put out the most competitive proposals together. All right, so with that kind of lay of the land established, let's turn to the process as it stands. And like any good landscape, the collaborative process of private foundation proposal development was not created all at once. This is something that's emerged over time through a process of slow and steady accretion and deposition. A couple of years ago, we tried to map out the many possible iterations of proposal development pathways at CSU, and it looked something like this. It's blurry and has minuscule font, so don't try to read it. It's mainly meant to illustrate how multivariate the process is in practice. Probably the most important takeaway is how once someone decides they want to pursue a private foundation funding opportunity, they'll generally route along one of three pathways: process naive, process veteran, or process averse. Our goal, in conjunction with all of you, is to educate those who haven't previously engaged in private foundation grant seeking, and B, win over those who are accustomed to working around the process so that everyone leaves a process veteran. Doing so not only helps smoother award management on the back end, but it also helps strengthen CSU's overall fundraising capacity by building skills in this regard. A rising tide lifts all boats. So then when it comes to the basics of private foundation grant seeking processes at CSU, I should start by saying that regardless of whether you loop us in and regardless of where you think the funding might land, more on those topics later, if there is a formal application and an accompanying budget required, all proposals to private foundations should be treated like any other proposal and entered into KRPD. Likewise, it's worth noting that there's no steering of a proposal toward a gift or a grant at this stage. That all really depends on the terms and conditions present in the agreement. And again, more on that later. This is probably as good a point as any to note how foundations are not a monolith. You see one foundation, you know one foundation. Nonetheless, there are four broad categories into which most foundations can be grouped. There's RFP-based, strategy, regional, and donor-driven. Most of the work flowing through research administration sponsored programs will be in those first two categories. The fourth category of donor-driven funders, that's typically the domain of advancement fundraisers out in the colleges and units doing individual fundraising. That third category, the regional funders, is where it can get a little murkier. They sometimes straddle the line, play acting the part of those more professionalized RFP and strategy funders, but can also be unfamiliar with universities, our structure, and expectations surrounding things like indirect cost policies. So with that kind of contextual tangent over, when it comes to foundation relations role in the grant seeking process, I'll lead off with the fact that engagement with foundation relations is voluntary. There's no formal requirement that people pursuing foundation grants engage our services. That said, we're here for a reason, many reasons in fact, but ultimately we're here to serve a complementary role to the research administration and sponsored programs teams across the university, where you all are primarily tasked with critical elements like compliance and budgeting and focusing on those very critical areas. We focus on maximizing the competitiveness of the proposal narrative. And with over 36 years combined time in our roles just here at CSU, the foundation relations team has been a reliable island of stability in a sea of fundraising uncertainty. Our consistency and success over the years has earned us a measure of trust and helped CSU punch above its weight with many national funders. But despite that track record, we can only help if we're looped into projects. So we try to be as proactive as possible in that regard and monitor KRPD entries every day for outgoing proposals. And when we see foundation proposals pop up, we reach out via email to offer our support to PIs. And as part of that, we copy the unit RAs and clarify how foundation relations proposal review is intended to be a complementary service that occurs in parallel with the standard KRPD submission and review process. Foundation relations is also integrated into the limited submission process for private opportunities. You'll see our follow-up after folks are selected by the Research Acceleration Office through InfoReady. And one other place you'll see our name pop up is in relation to managed sponsors. This is a list of around 25 key funders where there's a lot of activity or interest across the university. That list exists to ensure CSU is as coordinated as possible in its submissions and relationship with those funders. So specifically in KR, when a proposal is created, you might see the following message about contacting us for guidance. While that might seem a bit alarming, just know it's not meant to be any kind of gate restricting access. In most cases, we can have a number of simultaneous engagements with a given private foundation. Instead, think of the managed sponsors list as a welcome point where foundation relations helps ensure the continuity of the relationship between CSU and the given funder. Even if you don't see our outreach, though, just know we're here to help. Winter, spring, summer, or fall. So if you hear about a private foundation proposal or even just interest in a private foundation funder, please connect us with the PI and encourage them to work with us alongside your efforts. And if you're a PI, reach out to us directly. The earlier, the better. Even if it's last minute, there's still valuable assistance we can provide. And know we're happy to help on all foundation proposals at any stage. And when I say all proposals, I mean it, regardless of whether the proposal is being submitted under the auspices of CSU or CSU Foundation. Foundation Relations is here to be a partner. And particularly now when folks are seeing their usual funding options winnow, they might turn to foundations out of desperation, thinking that just getting something submitted is better than the certainty that comes with inaction. However, panic and kind of rushed efforts, lack of experience with a funder, all of that can lead to wasted effort. And worse yet, misaligned or poorly executed proposals can lead to funders getting bad impressions of CSU, which can subsequently impact our competitiveness in future years and opportunities. So why then should grant seekers work with foundation relations? Beyond all the reasons I've mentioned and everything implicit in the points I've made, I'm happy to say there's data also to encourage people to do so. So there, first off, are at least two different studies, one from NSF that's probably over a decade old at this point, but a recent one from Templeton Foundation earlier this year, and they both converge around the fact that nearly 40% of proposals get turned down because of either misalignment with the funder's goals for that given program or what they term preventable errors. And like I said earlier, CSU has a lot of great support inbuilt in terms of compliance and concurrence with guideline requirements. Research administrators and pre-award staff all play critical roles in that process, and I don't mean to underplay that. But our role is complementary. It's meant to address that key gap of content alignment with the funder's goals. The second data point in our favor is that a couple years ago, we ran the numbers and found that foundation proposals in which we've had some level of involvement with here at CSU going out, they're on the whole 33% more successful. All that to say, let's work together. So when it comes down to it, we need to preserve and strengthen every advantage CSU has in this era of seismic funding shifts. In fact, my office recently met with our foundation relations colleagues from research universities across the West, And they all reported a spike in not only interest about private foundations, but also strategic pivots their universities are making towards private foundations. This means competition is only going to increase in the private foundation world. Our colleagues also reported how major foundations have said they're in a wait and see mode. In other words, though some of them might instigate some and initiate some stopgap grant programs here in response to the federal funding shakeup. For instance, in recent interview I heard with Rockefeller's president, Rajiv Shah, described how the retrenchment from global aid would likely draw a lot of Rockefeller's funding focus for the time being. And if their tax statuses come under fire, who knows how that might additionally impact these funders' responses or their ability to respond. But we might not see how these foundations respond to this whole uncertain environment for a year or so as things kind of settle and they get a sense for where they can plug gaps and which gaps are most important to them from their perspective of wanting to address. Like Heraclitus taught, we live in a world of continuous change, and that's especially true today. What hasn't changed, however, is the focus of this presentation, though you'd be forgiven for thinking so as I meandered down all manner of byways from Michener to plate tectonics, Checkpoint Charlie to ancient Greece. I've blathered on quite a while now. So before we move on to talk in detail more about the dark sorcery underpinning the question of gifts versus grants and indirect costs for foundation proposals, perhaps we could pause for questions about any of the topics contained in my contextual soliloquy. Up to this point, any questions about advancement, CSU Foundation, foundation relations, how to work with us?
And I'm going to include 70s rock. So by the album cover choices. I'm not sure Carole King would be considered rock, but maybe a little bit.
Yes, I mean, it's a monumental album, so.
I have to admit, I've been at CSU for almost 18 years, and my thought about how advancement, foundation, all of it works, and including how a centralized office versus the college offices worked and work together, I did not understand. So I really appreciate that.
Cool.
There is a question about, do you have any stats on how many submissions to foundation have increased at the universities so far versus federal grants, that is?
We don't have live data on that. That's all through just kind of hearsay conversations with our colleagues at other universities. There's no kind of central data point. And we haven't looked. I guess that would be interesting. We could work with Doug to kind of and research analytics to look at and see if there are any trends kind of emerging at CSU. And right now it's all so fresh and new, with the federal funds being called into question, that people are only now just kind of turning to foundations. And so we won't really see, it takes a while to identify an opportunity and then get something out the door. So I would imagine as the year goes on, we'll probably see a greater and greater impact.
I don't have a question, but I'll just throw out there that it can greatly increase the quality of a proposal for folks to work through Sam and his team. They have lots of insight into how private foundations work, how their boards work, how they think about things that are foreign from an OSP concept. So please reach out to them.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate that.
And then the response in the chat, Sam, is just that they're also wondering how much more competitive foundational grants will be in the near future as well. So when we start getting data.
Yeah, I imagine that the competition will increase. Whether foundations start pouring more money into those programs to broaden the number of awardees remains to be seen. So it's all kind of evolving, day to day. So we'll see. So at long last, we come to the topic of gifts versus grants and what this means for you. Thankfully, I'm really glad Bill's here to share his insights and guidance on this topic. There's already been far too much of me droning on, but I'm going to drone on a little while longer before he comes in. So let me let you in on a little secret. namely that when it comes to awards from private foundations, there's no difference between gifts and grants in the eyes of the IRS. Both are philanthropic, both are charitable. In fact, the entire gift versus grant question is actually one internal to the university. The terminological distinction is a question of how an award is most appropriately managed, not whether or not it's philanthropic. This subtle distinction is really one of the major sources of confusion around the whole topic of gifts versus grants and private foundation funders. There's often the perception that gifts are the sole realm of philanthropy and live with the CSU Foundation, and there's a strict wall between them and the grant awards managed by sponsored programs and CSU that's never breached. Well, get your hammers ready because we're going to dispel that perception and talk about transaction determination. Now, despite the jargony sound of it all, the basics of transaction determination are actually fairly straightforward. It's just the process by which incoming awards are reviewed to determine proper management. Typically, the process is going to be initiated by the CSU Foundation when they receive award paperwork containing terms and conditions, though it can also be initiated by sponsored programs when an award is received that requires receipt by a 501c3. Once that determination process is initiated, sponsored programs and advancement determinators, currently Bill and I, review the agreement language, looking for terms and conditions that require a level of oversight and management that the CSU Foundation is unable to provide. I'll turn it over to Bill now to talk through our decision-making process on that front and some of the key points about what makes something a gift versus a sponsored project.
Thanks, Sam. The line between something that would be a gift and administered by the foundation and something that would be a gift with exception and administered through sponsored programs is not always a black and white distinction. So recognize that from the outset. But there are some hallmarks to terms and conditions that would lead us to conclude that a particular award probably is better managed as a sponsored project than as a gift. Gifts generally provide unrestricted use of funds, and they don't have many terms, if any, to how they're to be used or reporting requirements, what happens to intellectual property that's developed under the award, or publications that are publication prior approval that's required. Generally, something that would be a grant administered through sponsored programs would have financial reports, detailed financial reports that are required, annual and final progress reports. Those two can be very cloudy areas. Sometimes a gift also requires a, hey, how did you spend my funds? Or give us a report on, a progress report on how you've progressed on what you're using the funds for, which could still be a grant. So just because it says it requires financial or progress reporting may not be a firm distinction between the two. But things like intellectual property terms, requirements for prior approval for publications, set project periods, and proposals for carrying out something specific with specific people named as directing the project. Those tend to be things that are hallmarks of a sponsored project, so would fall under OSP purview rather than just as a gift. If they require us to get prior approval for changes to things like the budget or the PI or a change in the scope, those would be other hallmarks of something that probably ought to be administered as a sponsored project rather than as a gift.
So, after considering all of that, then, we ultimately emerge with one of three determinations. We have gifts, which are received and managed by CSU Foundation in coordination with college partners. Sponsored projects, which are received and managed by CSU sponsored programs, or a sponsored project with exception for those instances where an award has the hallmarks of a sponsored project, such that it requires management, but needs to be received by CSU Foundation as CSU's associated 501c3. When the first two determinations, they're fairly straightforward. It's this last category, the sponsored projects with exception, that's often shrouded in myths and confusion. Such is the nature of liminal spaces. We as a species struggle with the middle ground. Why worry about sponsored projects with exception? Surely, as an exception to the rule, these occurrences are rare. Well, it's precisely because of private foundations that this category really matters. It's where it most often crops up. Let's get our heads above the clouds to find out why. It comes down to those terms and conditions again. Foundation award agreements often have language that necessitates sponsored programs management. However, though there are many foundations able to make awards directly to CSU as a nonprofit, there are still a good number who, based upon their understanding of tax law, doggedly insist that they can only make contributions to 501c3 organizations like the CSU Foundation. It's those cases that make up the bulk of the sponsored project with exception determinations that we see. So naturally then, with funds being held by one entity and managed by another, there's some unique processes involved. I'll turn it over to Bill once again to provide more detail on the management of awards deemed exceptions.
Yeah. So if something comes in to the foundation and Sam and I look at it and we say, oh, looks like it's got those hallmarks of a grant, but it had to be given to a 501c3, it gets this distinction as a gift with exception, and it'll be managed under a 5.3 account. There are some things that we need for OSP to be able to set up the 5.3 account. So if it didn't go through KRPD, we need a KRPD proposal with the scope of work, a budget justification submitted through for the OSP team that you work with normally, for them to review. Then that proposal needs to be fully routed and approved, and the institutional proposal record needs to be set up so that we can then set up the 5.3. So all of those things need to happen in the flow, the workflow, just like for a normal sponsored project proposal and award. When the funds come in, the Department Research Administrator needs to submit a new gift fund request form to CSUF, and then CSUF will create that gift fund number, and payment from the sponsor gets deposited in that account, and then the monies from that gift account with the foundation are used when OSP invoices the foundation for payment on the 5.3 account as we expend and track those expenditures and payments within the 5.3 account.
Awesome.
Before
Yeah.
we move forward, I'm just going to recognize that there is a question in the chat.
Oh,
And this
okay.
is actually a really wonderful segue into, I'm thinking what you're talking about, but let me just read it to you so that, and it's, our issue is that our original proposal, IDC was not included. When it was determined after the fact that it is an exception, we had to add IDC, and that causes issues with the sponsor. Is there a way to better mitigate this? So I don't know if you want to answer that now, or let's talk about F&A and then we can discuss it.
We can address it now. I think the important thing is to just be as coordinated as possible on the front end, to look at that funder and their requirements, and we'll talk through kind of what foundations typically allow and their indirect cost policies. But if they have a posted rate, all outgoing proposals are required to incorporate that amount. Where those proposals kind of bypass the system or don't incorporate it on that front end, and then they kind of get routed back into the system upon receipt, that's where it can get, it can cause challenges, and we can help reach out to the funder and getting clarity regarding that. So now that we've talked about how private foundation awards are managed in this exception case, and thank you for that, Bill. Let's turn our attention then to another important consideration, indirect costs. And just yesterday, during one of the opening sessions of RAM Symposium, Doug Level gave a fantastic primer on the importance of indirect costs and what they underwrite in providing a functioning research environment here on campus. So we're not going to try to explain the purpose of indirect costs, just the basic context for how those costs are typically incorporated into private foundation awards. Kind of building on that, it's important to note that the vast majority of private foundation funders will not provide indirects at our negotiated federal rate. So I guess increasingly even the feds don't want to do that. But regardless, many private foundation funders will have an established limit or indirect cost policy. And this typically ranges anywhere from 0 to 15%. When funders have posted established processes, like I said, all outgoing private foundation proposals from CSU are required to incorporate the indirect costs up to that limit, even if that means incorporating none at all, like with the Keck Foundation, because CSU adheres to whatever that funder's limit is. When funders don't have a posted limit, it's not that they're necessarily inviting the incorporation of full indirects. Instead, it can be that they're simply naive to working with universities and even the concept of indirect costs in general. In those cases, my office is happy to work with you all to reach out to the funder for clarification of their policy. Sometimes they like to play coy and say that, oh, we don't have a set limit, but we don't want too much of the award to go to indirect expenses, whatever that means. In those cases, we incorporate the whatever the appropriate rate is based on the type of work being done. But more probably, the funder will be able to offer clear guidance that can inform budget development. And even though CSU may forego indirect costs on a given private foundation award, it doesn't mean that these awards aren't worth pursuing. In fact, foundation budgets are often more flexible and come with less stringent reporting requirements when compared against federal awards. Just sitting through yesterday's RAM Symposium session on auditing and the level of scrutiny that comes with federal awards, which was terrifying for me, by the way. Foundations don't take that approach. While the funds still need to be used for what we said we'd use them for, foundations generally take a more trusting stance when it comes to award management. And what's more, there are even some techniques you can use to incorporate costs that would normally be covered by indirects in a federal award in foundation proposal budgets. I'll turn it over to Bill now to talk through more of the F&A nitty-gritty of indirect costs budgeting with private foundations.
As we all know, indirect costs are real costs, despite what those in the public might think. And they include lots of things that don't appear above the surface. But we need to try to recover as many of those real costs as we possibly can from the university's perspective. And that's a long laundry list of those real costs that we do have with almost every project that gets funded at CSU. I won't go over all of those. Doug went over most of those in detail in his presentation on indirect costs yesterday. I just want to leave it there that those are real things that we need to try to cover. And again, it's kind of small and hard to read, but a good image for the kinds of things that indirect costs actually do cover at universities that was put together by Koger and other university national organizations. And something that we might be able to use in talking with those private foundations that are naive about what indirect costs are as a part of our budget justification. Perhaps we could link to this image to help them understand a little bit about what those costs are. And it's not just waste and inefficiency that we have 54% instead of the 15 that they might want to pay. Because we're required to follow cost accounting standards and treat all costs consistently. We don't have perhaps as much flexibility as we would like in budgeting things that are normally indirect costs as direct costs, but there are costs for like personnel time that I would suggest that we do try to include in our proposals. There are lots of foundations like the David and Lucille Packard Foundation that actually encourage indirect costs. So that, just going back to Sam's point about the wide range of funders, private foundation funders that know what they're talking about it with indirects, those that have an idea, and those that are just completely naive. And many of the grant-seeking entities do encourage us to include indirect costs in proposals. There's some links in the presentation to those pieces of advice, so feel free to take a look at those. A couple of articles on don't forget to budget indirect costs. So what can we do at proposal stage to try to recover those indirect costs? The first thing I would suggest is to make sure you actually read the application guidelines. Don't just assume that a sponsor won't pay indirect costs, but if they do specifically state we are not going to pay them, then we follow that and we would submit at 0. If they say they'll pay a limited amount, we propose at whatever that limited amount is. If they don't address it, my advice is to include indirects at CSU's fully negotiated indirect cost rate, or if you have a strong suspicion that they won't pay it, I would suggest working with Sam and the team in foundation relations to try to get some clarity from the sponsor so that we know up front what's going in, because that'll address Shannon's question about we proposed this with no indirect and now we're saying we have to have it and it's messing up the relationship with the sponsor, which is definitely something we don't want to do, in particular if we're going to have to rely on private foundations more and more as a source of funding for CSU's research and teaching activities. So, we want to be cognizant of keeping good relationships with our funders while balancing that with actually recovering all of the costs that it takes to do a project, and not forcing students to pay greater tuition because we're not recovering enough indirect costs to cover the cost of the projects that we're doing. So it's a balancing act. I would caution PIs not to reach out to sponsors and ask if indirect costs are allowed, and to have them work through Sam and his team rather than reaching out indirectly or reaching out directly to sponsors. It's better to have the folks who professionally work with private foundations make those requests for clarification than PIs doing it. If the guidelines state, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that they pay only a certain percentage of F&A, that's the one we would follow. Bill and Melinda Gates is another one of those. It allows some flexibility for things that we would normally consider to be indirects to be included as directs. So you can read through their policy and see that because they tend to fund things like vaccine intervention overseas, that they would allow the costs of setting up offices in those overseas locations and administrative costs for those as direct costs. So we could budget those kinds of things as direct costs, or we could budget a program manager that normally would be an indirect cost here at CSU as a direct cost on a project. That same concept of a project manager, we could include that as a direct cost, even if it's not an overseas sort of project. So those are some of the strategies for making sure that we're including as direct costs anything that is actually justifiable as wholly benefiting the project under direct costs rather than indirect costs. But the other administrative sorts of costs, we don't have a good way to recover. So like using CSU purchasing, those are still indirect costs that we're going to have to cover, and we can't figure out a way to to make those happen as a direct cost. But if you needed a conference proposal and needed somebody to manage making travel arrangements for all of the speakers for the conference, or travel arrangements for undergraduates coming in to do a research experiences for undergraduates, you could budget for a program manager to be doing those sorts of things. And so don't forget those kinds of things as direct costs. The three sort of categories to think of for things that would be direct costs, administrative and clerical costs that could be charged as direct costs, are listed on that slide. So administrative and clerical services that are integral to the federal award, or in this case, it would be the private foundation award. And that the individual has to be specifically identified with that particular award. And those costs would not also be recovered as indirect costs. So that's that distinction between something that we normally charge as indirects versus something that could normally be called an actual person, even though we might not always budget them as a direct cost on a project, since we don't normally budget administrative folks' time on projects. Any questions about that before we move on? The distinction there can get kind of fuzzy, I know.
I've always had this question, Bill, and my question is the third one. Does that mean that someone has to be hired into CSU specifically for that project and work solely on that project?
That is a good question, and I got to admit, I don't know financially how those get charged, but if somebody's time is charged on a 5.3 account, from my understanding through the financial system, we would not be charging indirect on their time as well, because the code that comes through financially for somebody paid on the 5.3 account, at least that portion of their time would not have indirects. It would not be being paid from indirects too. I don't know.
Wondered if there was somebody working on another project. So if their time was split, let's say they had 50-50 working on that, they couldn't be doing the exact same tasks on another project and being charged as an indirect charge, and then doing the same tasks on another one and not be charged as indirect.
I have to
was
admit,
also kind of my.
Do not know how that works within the financial system.
Okay.
And that's sort of the caution that we always have about trying to incorporate normally indirect costs as direct costs, because it can be hard to do. I will do some checking on that and see if I can get an answer, and we can maybe post an update.
Yeah, I think that it would be really important, especially with this landscape, because we might be having to start direct charging more things potentially. So if we could, as a university, maybe move forward and kind of come up with how we're going to do that potentially.
It would help if I was an accountant, but I am not. So
I'm not either.
I don't know how it happens. There are ways to make it happen, but I don't know what they are. I mean, we have lots of admin staff that get budgeted on sponsored projects, so it happens quite frequently. It's going to be the question of those people who, 75% of their job is already indirect cost covered administrative type tasks, but that 25% is on a 5.3 account. That I don't know exactly how we as an institution financially parse out not recovering F&A on that 25%.
Yeah, that's always the question. So one that I think that we need to work out, and and this is a great time that we can talk to Kim also, Melville Smith, and because we don't want this to be an audit thing. Yep. Going back and looking at our indirects, so all this is tying together. It's great. Okay.
It is tied together.
Yep. Sorry.
That's a good question. I wish I knew the answer to it, but I do not know the definitive answer. So.
Yep. And also in the chat is there some expectation of documenting the separate time for an admin person to prove it's not also indirect? So yeah, that's what we're.
I mean, that would be their time on the sponsored project or gift with exception project would be tracked through effort certification. So we would at least have that effort certification to show the time spent on the project, but how we document the second half of that, which is no indirect, is the piece that I don't quite know how we do that. So
So some follow-up to come, y'all. Maybe something we can discuss at a Ram Around event in the near future.
yeah.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So now where do we stand? We've presented a cross-section sampling of the common topics and questions we hear about in terms of advancement, CSU Foundation, gifts, grants, award management, indirect costs. We touched on the structure of university advancement, where foundation relations sits within it, how CSU Foundation is a separate entity from the two, outside of, but associated with CSU. We talked about the process of private foundation grant seeking and learned how foundation relations is a complementary resource available to assist anyone across campus pursuing private foundation awards. We sketched out the basics of the gift versus grant distinction and learned that it's more a question of internal management than charitability. We talked about transaction determination and its three possible outcomes, including the nebulous sponsored project with exception middle ground. And we wrapped up just now by digging into a little bit into at least indirect costs and how most foundations have established limits and maybe some of the budgeting techniques to more fully capture some of those costs that you would on federal awards in indirects. So we tried to touch at least on the major points of relevance when it comes to private foundation grant seeking at CSU. But I worry sometimes my presentations tilt more towards exhausting than exhaustive. So having talked so long today, there are surely, even with that, areas we elided or questions that are still hovering out there. But before we open it up to the final kind of batch of questions, I wanted to bring it all full circle and to a close by going back to Michener, who once said, "There are no insoluble problems, only time-consuming ones." And by working together on foundation awards as a big team, hopefully we can establish that level of common understanding that solves problems and minimizes the time consumed, taking things kind of from that insurmountably geologic time to something that exists more on a human scale. So if you take nothing else away from today, know that foundation relations, pre-award, sponsored programs, research administrators, we're all working together. We're all a team here and are resources for one another. And we're happy to take any questions, or if you have thoughts or experiences you'd like to share, please feel free.
There's a question about if PIs are interested in working with non-US foreign foundations or private institutes, do the same processes apply?
From the foundation relations perspective, we're still happy to assist in proposal review and alongside the standard kind of proposal submission process. We've worked on some from the UK and some from Canada, I think, before, some other places. But if there are any kind of additional steps that would be required on the KRPD sponsored programs proposal submission process, I can't necessarily speak to that. But in terms of engaging us, we're happy to work on anything. So
It might depend on the country.
yeah.
Yeah, some have similar legal requirements to donate to 501c3 types. So it might be useful to think about setting up the same process for foreign as for domestic ones.
Yeah.
Is there a specific term, or is it stated that it needs to be received when it has to come specifically to our foundation entity, as opposed to instead of being received as a sponsor grant, it's the exception one?
If the funder requires that the funds go to a 501c3, they have to go to CSU Foundation. And it could be one of those if there are other terms and conditions that make it more sponsored, more grant-like, that it would be a gift with exception.
And
So
it is typically spelled out in the award terms that this must be received by a 501c, or you certify as a 501c3 organization that you are receiving this, something to that effect. Sometimes It's just the funder's policy. I can't necessarily think of an example where it's, displayed on their website, but not incorporated into the agreement. But I suppose that could also happen.
Yeah, a lot of times they put in their guidelines, we only give to 501c3s, but the terms of the award don't address it.
Yeah.
Just they've said up front, we only give to 501c3s. Part of that goes back to the different readings of IRS regulations from many private foundations, thinking that they have to only give to 501c3s when they could also give directly to CSU as a state university, which also qualifies as a nonprofit. It just, we don't qualify as a nonprofit under section 501c3. We're 170B or C, I don't remember, but we fall under the nonprofit as an entity of the state of Colorado.
And I think some of the kind of confusion on the foundation's side rests on the fact that the CSU Foundation, as a 501c3, provides receipts, like charitable giving receipts. And I don't know does the university, when it receives things directly, I don't know that it provides that same charitable receipting function. And so that might be part of the foundation hang up.
Yeah, we do not provide that as from sponsor programs.
Well, and one thing from someone who's had this issue in the past about whether it was a foundation, whether it was not, whether it was a grant or a gift, etc. At proposal stage, sometimes you'll be given a name of somebody and a PI coming to say, hey, I've been contacted by X. Sometimes there isn't necessarily a written solicitation around what it is that they're talking about. So sometimes you do have to go out and look at their website. So it's not always going to be written down in a solicitation with everything really spelled out. We've had to go to the website, and sometimes the websites do have a lot of good information as opposed to what you're given to begin with in order to start a proposal at the beginning. So if you suspect, or if it's a sponsor that you've never heard of, do a little bit of legwork at the beginning for those of you who are in pre-award, just to help yourself out. And this is going back to Shannon's question about how can we mitigate this? Because sometimes the answers are, get foundation involved, by the way, if you haven't heard from them, or if you're setting up the KR and you see that they're a managed sponsor, but go do some research as well. So, we always talk about in pre-award that we need to read our solicitations, that we need to really be looking at those things ahead of time, but sometimes the information from these foundations isn't in that written solicitation. So go do some legwork and also go look at their website. And because sometimes they have a lot of information on there, or strange applications, or a weird budget form, or lots of other things that are on there. So making sure that you're reading all the materials that are available. That's just one of those things that came to mind when you guys were talking about, and when Kat asked, does it say this? Well, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it's not until that award shows up that it's there, but sometimes it's on their website. There were some other questions. With the current federal government funding landscape, we are seeing an increased interest of PIs seeking funding and partnerships with private corporations and donors. How best should we disseminate this information to our PIs about foundation relations role in these new interactions?
I would say, if you hear about that and they're approaching and it's a private foundation funder, just connect them with us, and we're happy to discuss through any things that might come up and help guide and shape that kind of proposal development and strategy. If there are specific questions, we can kind of help them interact. Either, a lot of times the funder will, and the program officers at the funders will want that one-on-one relationship with the person actually doing the work. So we play kind of more a supporting role in those discussions. But other times we reach out directly to the funder and get clarification on questions and terms. And a lot of times when it gets to that kind of contractual nitty-gritty, we're happy to play that role, because otherwise it can lead to confusion.
And Sam, your office is putting out monthly, I think it's monthly, isn't it? A list of foundations and things that are
Yeah.
coming available for people to
We
potentially.
have an RFP list, and it's kept up to date, and it's curated, and it's live. There's the link to it goes out monthly as a reminder, but it's live all the time. So encourage folks to look there. I know with the university rolling out its Pivot subscription, which has not only federal opportunities but private opportunities as well, and from all over the world, and a bunch of great resources on there. Folks should definitely sign up and create profiles on there. But our RFP list, we're still assessing whether Pivot is a replacement or just an augment to that. And I think at least for the time being, we're going to continue to maintain that RFP list that we do as a more curated subsection of private foundation opportunities that are most of relevance to CSU, and you can sort it by, different college, focus areas and whatnot. So yeah, that's a great place for folks to go looking for opportunities. But yeah, if anyone just has questions about foundations, just connect them to us.
Is there a way for people to sign up for the listserv for that listing?
Yeah, can email me or Dennis Bigelow on our team. He manages that RFP list and the monthly emails about it. So we're happy to add anyone who wants to be.
And Pivot, for everyone who's interested, is going to be the new system, and it is managed by the Research Acceleration Office, so RAO. From what I gather, they're going to be doing some more in-person type trainings for that Pivot, and there's also just some tutorials on their website as well. So that's another, you can tell your PIs, or if there are PIs on this call, that they can go and take a look at that as well if they are interested in looking for more RFPs for foundations, etc. But getting you guys involved. So there are also situations where the proposal has to be submitted by a 501c3 in response to an RFP. What are the steps to coordinate a submission through foundation relations?
Great. Yeah, that's a good question. Again, looping us in as early as possible in that process, because we can coordinate and act as that liaison with the CSU Foundation to let them know that a proposal is going in under their name, and there's no real clearance check there, but just to make sure they're aware of it, and then provide a lot of times in those cases there'll be required attachments and documentation that's needed, from the perspective of the CSU Foundation. So its 501c3 letter, its audit, its recent 990 tax return, those sorts of attachments are common, their board list, things like that. So we can help gather those and get those attached to the proposal submission as well. So just loop us in as early as possible, and we can help not only advise on the proposal content, but help with any of that CSU Foundation related material as well.
I'll just add that reaching out to Sam early on for those foundations that don't have indirect cost policies can help everybody formulate, before we submit a proposal, how we're going to approach the indirect cost recovery question with that particular proposal. I know, Sam, you tout your excellence at helping with the project narrative, but you've got insight into how these smaller private foundations think about indirect costs, probably more than we do in OSP too. So we can find the right balance to try to recover as much indirect as we can without turning them off. So.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's great, Bill. Thank you.
And another question is, if there is no published policy, is an indirect cost waiver form required?
If you're not proposing at the full, yes. And I can't guarantee you whether the Vice President for Research Office will approve it or not approve it.
Yeah, and we've run into some sticky situations with that. In the one example I kind of alluded to during the presentation, where the funder said, we don't have a policy, but we don't want too much. And I said, well, this is the rate. And they're like, well, that's too much. But they also wouldn't give guidance on what would be, their limit of too much. So because they said, this will significantly affect its competitiveness, and we don't want to waste people's time if because we need to incorporate, our negotiated rates for that particular funder or project. If that suddenly makes the project infeasible from the funder's perspective, we want to try to avoid that kind of lost effort if there's no way around it. So
sponsor emails
yeah.
won't usually do. It should be a published policy, but that's why I'm saying Sam and his group as the intermediary there, rather than having PIs or department research administrators reaching out to sponsors.
Yeah, because a lot, for some of these smaller regional funders, they either don't have very sophisticated web presence or something, and so they might have an indirect cost policy in their bylaws or something that's not posted on a website, but it exists as a formal document. So
I also would argue that hopefully over time, if we can approach them without turning them off, to educate them on what indirect costs are and why they're important to us, and that it's not some rate we pull out of the air and that we're making a profit actually out of all of it. That
right.
Maybe we can move the ball on some of these funders, at least in their level of sophistication about understanding indirects, even if they still don't want to pay our full.
Right.
At least they can understand a university's perspective on it.
Yeah, and I do try to provide some level of education when I reach out to them. And I think the national conversation and focus on indirect costs of all things, who thought that would rise to national prominence, but I think that'll, make it more aware in people's minds. And hopefully the conversation will kind of shift towards the importance of those rather than kind of berating and belittling them. But we'll see how that evolves. That might be a battle we have to fight, or something that's working in our favor.
Ginny had a question about fully burdening budgets to private foundations, and that can be a strategy, but my fear is always that will come back to bite us on the post-award side if they don't understand that they're being charged indirects, and then we send a financial report, for instance, that would be transparent and show the indirects. They'd be like, wait, we didn't know we were paying this. So it can be trickier than we might think to include that, but it depends on what the award terms are, and often we don't know at proposal stage what the award terms are going to be. So we're playing guessing games in a lot of that. So yes, fully burdening can be a strategy, but there may be downsides to it as well.
And then just a comment about what they heard is that a result of the conversation with OSP and Foundation Relations, the PI would like to proceed with a proposal at a reduced indirect cost rate. Then the IDC waiver form is required, but there is no guarantee that OVPR will approve the waiver request, and this could make accepting an award problematic.
I guess I would say it could not only make accepting the award problematic, it could make submitting the proposal problematic. Theoretically, the waiver should be approved before the proposal is submitted.
Yeah, hopefully it wouldn't get to the point where we were awarded an award, given an award, and then couldn't accept it because of something like that. So hopefully we could head that off before.
The more we can get PIs to not submit proposals to foundations without following the process of having a proposal, the better off we'll all be as far as heading off that indirect cost question at award stage.
Yeah, that's been.
We'll never catch it completely, but
right. Yeah, those cases where people kind of work around the system are the ones where we most often see that. So
often that working around the system is not. I would give people the benefit of the doubt and say that they fall into Sam's naive category, not right. Averse category.
We just want to thank you all for attending.